Welcome. My name is Patty Murray, and I will be your host for today's Food Safety Tech webinar, a preventative approach to food safety and quality, FSQA responsibilities along the food supply chain. Before we begin, let me provide you with some important housekeeping information. If you have any technical difficulties, please try logging off and then logging back in. If this still does not work, please contact WebEx support at 1-866-229-3239. Please feel free to send in your questions to our speakers throughout the event using the Q&A feature. We'll send you a copy of the slides and a link to the webinar archive by close of business Monday, March 18th. It's my pleasure to turn things over to Rick Bios, President and Publisher of Food Safety Tech, who will introduce our agenda, speakers, and moderate a Q&A session after the presentations. We will assist as many of your questions as possible. Rick?
Thank you, and welcome everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsor, SafetyChain Software. SafetyChain's mission is to help food suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and service companies enforce safety and quality compliance at all points along the supply chains, while creating efficiencies resulting in hard dollar return on investment. We have an informative agenda for you today, and we'll be covering responsibilities along the supply chain, how technology will help, and we'll also be taking your questions at the end of the presentations. To introduce our speakers today, we have a special guest today, a good friend of mine, Paul Ryan, who is the President and CEO of Global Food Safety Linkages. Paul will be joined in the presentation by Barry Maxon from SafetyChain. Now, I'm excited to introduce Paul. Paul is a food safety and quality management professional and independent consultant in the agri-food sector. Paul has extensive experience with the primary production, food manufacture, and retail sectors, holding executive management positions within privately owned food and animal feed manufacturing companies and government agencies in Australia, the SQF Institute in Switzerland, and Washington-based Food Marketing Institute. Paul's a graduate of food science. He designed, developed, and championed the international rollout and acceptance of the SQF code, program designed to facilitate improved product safety and quality in the agri-food sector. One of the founders of the Global Food Safety Initiative. Paul focused on supply chain issues and established Global Food Safety Linkages to service the agri-food sector. Paul?
It's me, is it?
It is.
Okay. Thanks, Rick, and good afternoon to everyone. It's just ticking over midnight here in Australia. I'm calling from Perth on the west coast, and making this presentation from a long way away. So it's my first attempt at a presentation in this one, so we'll see how we go. The presentation that I'll make today, I've drawn on my experiences in up the SQF program and in working in the various aspects of the food industry. And the experiences that I have come out from my many dealings with stakeholders that make up the food supply chain. So as I go through this presentation, drawing on that experience and some of the issues that have arisen as part of my more recent working with SQF and working with the agri-food sector. So I'll go here. Oh, hang on, I'll click this. This is big responsibilities on the food supply chain. What I want to cover when I open this program, I'm looking at these issues. Who is in fact responsible for food safety and quality? How do buyers demonstrate due diligence in their buying practice, and the impact of requirements imposed on the supplier by the retailer. And that's in addition to the GFSI endorsed standards. And I think this is an issue that will come out as I go through this presentation as a major point here. And what I'm also looking at in this presentation is where do we go to from here? I'm going to be suggesting one or two points I think we need to look at, and particularly from a global perspective. What's going on? Okay, so what do we know? That the same products continue to be implicated in food safety incidents, in spite of the fact that we have these UBUT systems in place, these quality management systems in place, improved regulation, and so forth. We still seem to have the food safety incidents, and that can be because of downs in the system, or it may be because we have better surveillance and better reporting. But at the end of the day, we still seem to see these things crop up, and they all seem to implicate the same types of products. I know that outbreaks linked to imported foods are increasing, and in the presentation I'll be looking at the development of the global sourcing of food and the problems that come along with that. And food safety incidents, they continue to occur. Why? Because the link in the supply chain, and really it's about people not shouldering their responsibility. And we can also look at issues as to why maybe that's happening as well. So back and do a little bit of background. In putting this presentation together, I thought it's neat to go back and see where we've come from. And so looking here, if we look at a one-dot coin, for example, and if we look back in the 1970s and 80s when I started to get involved in this, and we who had influence in the food sector, note that the primary producer, that is the farmer, the people who are growing the raw materials and so forth, doing reasonably well, depending on routes and so forth. But they were getting a decent return for their efforts. There were a number of smaller primary producers in the system, and they were feeding very well into a manufacturing sector that was also had quite a deal of influence. The manufacturing sector were making a lot of their bread products and putting them into the marketplace. Brokers, and the brokers are the ones that were mainly sourcing commodities from various parts. And finally, we have the retailer who was also getting a good return. So if we fast forward to 2000, you can see that in 2000, the return or the share of the dollar by the primary producer has greatly reduced. Only that, the number of smaller producers is diminished, and we're getting bigger ones, and also that is an issue, particularly here in this country that I'm from anyway, and I do know that it's happening in various parts of the world. The manufacturers, their influence is slowly reducing as well, and then in consequence, the brokers have changed their style of operation to become more food sources and doing work on behalf of retailers to develop products and to be an extension, essentially, of a retail arm. And then finally, if you look at most of the I guess the profit in the food industry is going out. It's the retailer, and this is a fact of life. I mean, here in Australia, where I'm from, we've had two major retailers, and they have 80% of the business of the food industry here. If you look at the price on the stock market, they're two most successful companies in the country, and so this is a fact of life. So if we once again, in the 1970s and 80s, the influence in the supply chain was with primary production manufacturing and not so much with retail. But now if we look at in the years 2000 and beyond, we can see that influence is greatly with the retailer. And what I like to come out of these slides is a demonstration that the retailers have a great influence on that supply chain. And in fact, in turn, the responsibilities, the impact of the responsibilities along that supply chain as well. Here, in this slide, is just a very simple supply chain. We have a primary production, a manufacturer, I'm calling it a broker, the next link, and then we have the retailer. And then finally, we have the consumer. And if we look at the responsibility to deliver, it's pushed back up the chain. And if the delivery distribution, it follows in a fairly normal sequence. What I'll be covering today is a lot of the inputs that go to the various links in that supply chain. Primary production, there's an enormous amount of inputs that happen there, from feed manufacturers to medications and so forth. I'm not going to get into detail on that at all, other than to mention that these issues are already there. We look at consumer. We look in the 1970s and the 1980s, and we're going to sort of do a little trip back and come forward again as we go through this presentation. The information gap was there. The consumers really didn't have much information about the foods that they bought. They had a lot of trust in retailers, and if you look at the shelf in the supermarkets, mainly big brand manufacturers were represented. The overall that we're now starting to see develop today really wasn't there. We switch to today. Also we can see that the consumer's perception of food safety, and this was something that sort of came out fairly early in the work that I was doing, was that people seemed to think that the food safety threat came from chemicals. They were very concerned, particularly in this market here and in Europe, about chemicals, about genetically modified foods and so forth. And microbiology really wasn't the issue. But we do know now that, so Daisy, what's going on? The whole thing is reversed, that chemicals are not the real issue, but microbiological issues are. So it's the microorganisms and so forth. Unfortunately, in the early days when we were setting up SQF programs, our retail customers were insisting that chemicals and that be treated as a major issue because of the very impact that this perception had in the marketplace if product going to the marketplace had excess chemical in it. So, we needed to consider that, but things have changed a little. So we know that our consumers are more health conscious. We see they're more informed. They're more concerned about issues about food safety, about the quality of foods, about labels, nutrition and so forth. They're organised, more vocal, and really aware. They're more interested in where food is coming from, who's making it, what's the impact of that distribution system on people. And they're more prepared to act. They're more prepared to change and go and buy product from another retailer. The connection. This is we know the consumer's connection with the food supply chain mostly begins and ends with the retailer. They don't have any connection with the supply chain past retail. And so, they tend to build up a lot of consumer trust with their retailer. And this is most evidence that we've seen. So what responsibilities do the consumers have in the food supply chain? Well, we know that the consumers can contribute to a lot of food safety incidents because they don't handle product correctly. So what we need to do really is to read labels, handle, store and prepare foods properly. That's about the best we can offer for the consumer. Our retailer, 1970s and 80s, the retailers were dealing with in-store GMPs, logistics, dealing with brokers, mainly with brand suppliers. Some retailers were developing own-label products products. In the main, a lot of these were low-cost generic type products. Retail did have a technical team. They had product development, and they also had an audit group who would go out auditing a lot of their suppliers. 2000, we have had it as now being moved forward in the retail environment. Logistics, no longer sourcing a lot of products locally or within country. They're sourcing a lot of products globally, and it's not necessarily from the next country. It can be from various third countries around the world, and there's a lot of raw materials coming out of those sources. They are dealing directly with suppliers now, not going through second parties. A lot of retailers now are dealing directly with their suppliers, and the technology has allowed them to do that. They're doing more of their own brand, more involved in product development, and having our products manufactured for them by contract manufacturers. Obviously, in the US, I know that in your market over there, a lot of retailers own manufacturing sites, and to upgrade those sites to ensure that they're on the same level as the contract manufacturers that they're dealing with as well. Retailers globally are now supporting the GFSI standards. Supporting, and we'll pick on this later on in a number of different ways, but they are supporting the standards, and the impact that has on that, we'll catch up with that as I go through the presentation. In jurisdictions, some countries, some retailers are adding their own requirements, and this is where problems start to occur, particularly with GFSI and the intent of GFSI. Retailers can nominate their own audit body. So doing as well is becoming more socially accountable, social accountable issues and animal welfare issues. So, the retail today is a lot different to what it was many years ago. And this has all been driven by, as I said before, a consumer that's more informed, more aware, and more prepared to act. What we know is the retailer has, through this whole process, they have increasing influence with the consumer. Retailers, because of the very nature of their business, have to plan for the inevitable incident. Dealing with a number of different products, a lot of different high-risk products, a number of different suppliers, sourcing them globally, and so they're needing to make sure that they plan for the inevitable incident. It is going to happen. Retailers require suppliers implement a GFSI standard. Most of them do. Some still don't, but most of the major global retailers are moving forward in this direction. And as before, as that process, some retailers are imposing additional requirements. And quite rightly, when you're looking at them protecting their own brand, they're possibly entitled to do that. The retailer's responsibility is aligned to its resources. The bigger companies have more resources. They're able to do more things. They're able to monitor the food supply chain. But it's also aligned to the culture of the retailer as well. And if the retailer doesn't have the culture to look at these issues, well then maybe there's a breakdown there. Responsibility number 2, and this counts to the retailers. Retailers are accountable for the safety of the food itself. I think that's a given. It's responsible for educating consumers. If we're going to be dealing with consumers and consumers are in a trusting mode, well then obviously the retailers need to ensure that those consumers are educated in how to handle food, prepare it and so forth. Also, the retailer is responsible for monitoring its supply chain. And I think this is probably, and it's how they go about this, I think, that is to debate. Look at the broker. The broker really, in early days, was sourcing commodities. Their main issue was import regulation. Really didn't have much to do with anyone. Just bought commodity in and made it available to people who wanted to buy it. most of the bigger brokers, or the agents as I probably could call them, they're partially owned by retailers. I know that in the United States that you have some major companies there who do new product development on behalf of retailers. They'll set specifications. They'll nominate a GFSI standard that the suppliers or the contract manufacturers need to implement, and also doing that, they'll pass on the requirements of their retail client to implement the various audit requirements that need to be undertaken as well. So broker really at this particular point, and in the context that I'm looking at here, is really an extension of retail. For those retailers that don't have big resources to be able to take on this function. So the broker at the moment is one of the interfaces between the retailer and the supplier. And the broker, they have control of product development and its sourcing. They also have control of supplier selection, specification, and also the supplier audit. So if we look at the responsibility here at broker level, they're responsible for communicating and enforcing the same quality requirements for the products they source on behalf of their retail clients. So that's a very important role here to play. The manufacturer. And when we look at the manufacturer, there's many different types of manufacturing. There's first stage manufacturing, there's second stage manufacturing. I'm sort of going to lump them all together here. And in the manufacturing world in the 70s and 80s, as I said before, there are lots of big manufacturers. There were a lot of smaller manufacturers. And there was contract manufacturing happening, of course. But a lot of own brand was available and on the shelf space, as I mentioned. Manufacturers involved in product development, particularly the bigger ones as they are today. Regular issue, retailers had to look at HACCP. HACCP was becoming a buzzword in regulation, and back in, particularly when I was looking at developing the SQF program, one of the reasons why these types of programs had appealed to manufacturing was because they were subject to numerous audits. And I know that in the US, when I was there, once I know one company was having at least 60 audits a year, 60 plus, and they basically employed people as for auditors, really, just to help get through that process. So, this was a real big issue for the manufacturer. If we fast forward to today, HACCP is now mandatory mainly in most countries and in most industry sectors. If they're retail in particular, and I guess with some large manufacturers, GFSI standards are required. I mentioned before, and this keeps on cropping up, they need to deal with some additional retailer requirements, whether that be specification, whether that be audit. It'll be some unique issues that retailers see as important to them. They still have to have a number of audits, but it's not because of the fact that they're getting numerous suppliers. What's happening is that, and this was brought up to me the other day, is that in particular different retailers are supporting different GFSI standards. And so there was one retailer in Switzerland, one manufacturer in Switzerland, who was saying that they have to maintain 3 different standards because their clients, they're manufacturing on behalf of a number of retailers in Europe, won't accept BRC or IFS or the ISO 20000. So they're having to maintain and implement those things, those standards, and 3 different audits and so forth. Brands, they're doing a bit of manufacturing for retail brands, and within that, the retail brands are looking for high quality, safety, and standards. The issue that the manufacturer is having to contend with, and it's not on this slide, but something I'd like to mention anyway, is that they're working particularly dealing with retailers and their buyers under reduced margins. The pressure's always on them to keep their costs down. And this is something that they're having to grapple with as well. Now, the manufacturer is under increasing pressure from their customer. They're under increasing pressure from the customer to supply safety and to supply quality, and to do that consistently. Producers of high-risk products, the manufacturers of high-risk products are similarly need to implement a nominated GFSI standard. In fact, most manufacturers are now asked to do this and to comply with their customer requirements. Additionally, also, in the past, the retailer used to come around and do the audit, but now they're having to bear all associated costs with that audit, with that certification. And as I said before, that adds up when you've got to run 3 different standards. Responsibility. The manufacturer has a responsibility to source safe raw materials, apply safe practices, implement asset management, and basically comply and meet their customer requirements. But they do that and do that consistently and do that all the time. We go down to the farm, the primary producer. One thing, back in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of smaller farms around. Didn't have any audits, none bothered them. Didn't have a quality management system in place. Essentially low risk. They had mitigation, but that was more around chemicals and the use of chemicals and medications and so forth, and crop protection. So life on the farm wasn't too bad. To today, we are now looking at more larger farms and a demise of smaller farms. The smaller guys just couldn't absorb the costs of still in the system, so to speak, unless they worked in cooperatives and banded together like that. There's a very strong customer influence, and that influence, when you're dealing directly with the retail sector and so forth, is quite strong. Retailers, as we said before, they're now starting to develop their own brands. They need to ensure that the supply chain has systems in place to protect that brand and for their passing requirements back down the line. There's increased regulation because of the recent food safety incidents associated with goods that come out of primary production. HACCP now has been bandied around as something that needs to be implemented in the primary production sector and risk systems, again, as with retail and with manufacturing. There's more documentation for the quality management system, spray diaries, medication diaries, and so forth, are needing to be better utilised and be able to be audited and be auditable. Being subjected to audits from customers or from certification bodies or from audit companies in the past. And there's increased scrutiny over the use of medication and crop protectants. So life for the farm has changed considerably for the farmer. Once again, as with the manufacturer, the primary producer is having to work on reduced margins as well. And this is obviously a bit of an issue. The primary producer is under increasing pressure from its customers. It's similar to the manufacturing side. So high-risk products are required to apply risk management standards. We know the issues with the leafy greens and with this other industry sectors, with agriculture and so forth. They need to comply with their customer audit requirements. So the farm has really changed. There's no doubt about that. They have a responsibility to source safe raw materials, and I guess this is an issue. I'm working currently in the feed milling industry. We do it with intensive farming here, and a feed miller, we're now being by growers of intensive poultry, pork, the dairy industry, and so forth, to ensure the feeds that we supply into that sector are safe. have micro loads. Salmonella is an issue. So as a manufacturer of feed, we then have to look at our systems to make sure that we are able to deliver those outcomes. So the primary production sector is having to apply HACCP, in some cases, good agriculture practice, good high practice, and look at risk management, particularly those high-risk foods, as I've mentioned. So before I move on to the service providers, I just want to make a bit of a point here that you're in manufacturing and you're in primary production. Your product to the marketplace, you've got to go through what I've sort of worked with the gatekeeper. And it's known today that, you know, for the manufacturers or the producers of the product of the marketplace, they have to go through that gatekeeper, and that gatekeeper is the retailer. So they really need to accept this fact. This may give us an insight into why we have incidents in the food supply. The supplier pressure to absorb costs and to keep the customers happy. And maybe in some cases where this is difficult, some suppliers are taking shortcuts. And this may be where we're having incidents, food safety incidents. So to make that as an aside. We move out to the service providers. While they're responsible for safety or quality, I'm going to make this point. They don't make the food. They don't hand food. They just provide a service to the sector. Responsible for, I guess, is to provide professional service. And I'm going to outline these responsibilities as I move through this presentation and outline where I think we need to be very clear on. So, regulator, the government role is changing, but in general, I think it's a reactive rather than a proactive approach. In the US, you've got the new Food Modernization Act and everything there, and that's great, and that's all moving forward. And that's being applied in manufacturing as such. But for farmers, the application of HACCP and documented risk assessments is coming as well. And we can see it coming through in various areas as well, here in Australia and elsewhere. So with that, we know that these issues that need to be addressed. I guess in terms of HACCP on the farm and how the regulator can enforce that, there are issues that remain to be addressed. Enforcement is a real issue. I guess the key point here is that we're now looking to a preventative approach to control rather than a sledgehammer approach to regulation. The Regulators' Responsibility is to develop and maintain scientifically based regulation, develop interpretation, information and communication material. It's important that this happens because the broad section of the manufacturing and primary production sector who need to have these materials so they can better understand how the regulations apply to them and what they need to do to comply. The regulator still enforces requirements, they investigate incidents, they can prosecute offenders, and they manage country-to-country requirements. They're sort of the simple issues that they do. If we look at the standards owner, now the standards owner are the private standards that are owned by various organisations, and these are the standards that are GFSI endorsed, and these are the ones I'm talking about. So, as I understand it, there are about 6 standards that have been endorsed by the Global Food Safety Initiative, and there's 3 pending. 2 standards that were in the frame for benchmarking have, as I understand it, been withdrawn. In looking at these standards, and I was obviously involved in developing one of them, private standards deal with a number of issues that tend to exceed regulatory requirements, but they're typically based around food safety. just I guess another way of packaging it so that it's a more auditable approach to control. As I said, standards are privately owned, and they're owned by an organisation or an association. So they're owned by, for example, the Food Marketing Institute owns the SQF standard, the BRC owns the Retail Consortium standard, IFS owns the German retailers own the IFS standard and so forth. I think they're shared between German and French. And the 22,000 standards is sort of managed by a Dutch organisation. In looking at these different standards, there's obviously competition between the standards owners to get suppliers and to get retail support and so forth. And there's when you're dealing on a global market and you look at the BRC standard, for example, very solidly supported by the BRC retailers. So you have a customer, a manufacturer, like I mentioned earlier on, in Switzerland, who's dealing with retailers, dealing with retailers, dealing with French retailers and some other retailers. When you have a situation where retail customers insist on their own country-based standard or their own association-based standard, that's where things start to go pear-shaped. And this is where suppliers start to tear their hair out, particularly when the documents are benchmarked against the GFSI benchmark document as being essentially the same. So that's where the suppliers really start to get a bit fancy, so to speak. They vary, well, mostly. So according to about 5 years ago, the World Trade Organization had an inquiry into these standards and why they were being implemented. And the outcome was that they weren't a trade barrier, according to the WTO, but remained under consideration. However, if you want to deal in the industry, if you want to be a player and you're a manufacturer or a big prime producer today, if you want to be in the game, you have to implement one of these standards. And it's basically a prerequisite to doing business. And that's not bad. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's good. But what I'm saying is it's a fact of life. So, standards owners' responsibility. Well, we have to maintain the standard to GFSI benchmarks requirements, and they also have to keep it up to date. That doesn't mean to say that these standards have to keep on changing every year, and then companies have to go back and make amendments to their systems and be audited again and incur costs. It'd be nice if the standards could remain stagnant or without change for at least a 5-year period, similar to the ISO to standardisation. The owner's responsibility is also to license, manage, oversee the accreditation, the audit, and certification activity. And so with different accreditation bodies in the world, we're dealing with the UCASs of this world, JASANs here in Australia, the US accreditation body, French, and so forth. It goes on and on and on. With different certification bodies, you'll see that a number of all the standards owner have licenses with a varied range of certification bodies. And the certification bodies then employ auditors as well. The standard then needs to set the audit criterion and standards. So the criteria the certification body needs to comply with, to set the requirements for the auditors, and also then establish training standards so that the auditors can be trained. And again, this adds cost to the certification body, because if they be out there auditing the BRC standard, the SQF standard, the ISO 22000 standard, guess what? The auditor has to be trained in that standard. But to then maintain their knowledge of those standards and so forth. And the standards owner's responsibility also is to settle disputes between the certification body and their clients. Certification body. When we come to the certification body, we know that they've got to be licensed by the standards owner. We've just spoken about that. They've got to manage and oversee the application of the certification service created on behalf of the standards owner. So they're an agent of the standards owner and own the standard, and they're an agent to ensure that the supplier complies with the requirements of that standard. They're accredited by an international accreditation body. Obviously, they have to be ethical in their business practices and how they go about it. That's a very brief description. The key point I'd like to make here, though, is that the actions of the certification body can make or break a private standard. I think that's why we need to look very critically at that, some of the different training requirements and that each of the different standards owners apply. In all of these training courses, they cost the certification body money, and also then passed on to guess who, the company who's being audited. So, this is another issue that have a whereby suppliers are being asked to implement these various standards. They're being asked to put systems in place to demonstrate responsibility. They're also being asked to bear the cost of that as well, as I mentioned before. And as these requirements and that change and so forth, these costs go up. So if you're in manufacturing or in primary production, you're being squeezed at one end and costs are going up the other end, just to be in the game. And so that's why possibly some are dropping out. Or they're taking shortcuts, as I mentioned before. So, this is sort of all starting to come together. The body's responsibility, they're responsible for engaging, obviously, qualified auditors. They need to manage conflict of interest, and these will occur. Today, they're engaging qualified auditors, but a lot of certification bodies are engaging auditors under contract. They're not employees of the company. And so some of those contractors may very well be working with different people in other aspects as a consultant, helping people put systems in place. And the certification body needs to ensure that line an auditor to a manufacturer that there's no conflict of interest. And this is challenging sometimes. They need to match the auditor to the client. So that what I'm saying there is that the auditor needs to have knowledge and understanding and skills applicable to the supplier that they're auditing. So you're not going to send a very expert in to a fruit and vegetable manufacturing site. It's never had anything to do with fruit and vegetable processing or manufacturing before. So these are the sorts of issues that need to crop up. They need to conduct supplier audits and issue the certificates. So once the company's been audited, the certificate is issued to say, yes, they meet the requirements of the standard. I guess the other consideration here as well is that, auditing is a business, and the certificate bodies are in business to make money. And so, they need to ensure that they make money for their shareholders as well. So in some cases and in some parts of the world, there is a tendency for, particularly that point number 3, matching the auditor with the client, with the certification body to send an auditor out to do an audit that may not be very well qualified or experienced in the area that they're auditing. And this is very closely monitored and policed by the standards owner. The whole thing can come unstuck. I know that I mentioned China, but when I was with SQF, the China was a real issue for us in terms of corruption. And there are instances where there are numerous fraudulent SQF certificates issued, and one instance I remember in particular is that, the certification body said the supplier who was told by the retailer they had to have an SQF certificate, that they indicated that, well, that's okay, pay $20,000 and you'll have the SQF certificate next week. We'll send the order out and do the certificate. So it really doesn't happen like that. And these issues were happening all the time. And the standards owner is prepared to police that aspect, part of the business. Well, then that's another breakdown happens in the supply chain with a service provider. And I'm forward where the service provider is not actually their job, they're not being responsible. But it happens, particularly in locations, in various countries, cultural differences and so forth. So the only other point that I want to make here when it comes to the certification bodies is that they've got to allow the auditor sufficient time to conduct the audit. Now, under some of the rules now with the GFSI and so forth, they're setting times for auditors to go and do audits. And, if you have an inexperienced auditor, if you have a very detailed and complicated process, it's extremely difficult to do that in a day, 2 days. So in some cases, when you try and set these timelines and don't allow the auditor sufficient time to do the job properly, well, then things get missed. And it's just a point that I sort of wanted to raise as well. So that's certification body. Safety initiative. We're near the end of my presentation, and I think we'll leave the best to last, I guess. The Global Food Safety Initiative is not standard, as we know that. It's a benchmarking system. In the standards owner, enforcement, but I'll get to that later on. Benchmarking system, and it was established by the Global Food Safety Initiative or by retailers to standardise benchmark standardise and benchmark certification standards, and various schemes aligned to the food sector. So, very simply, a group of brothers got together back in 2000. Were responding to obviously issues, mainly numerous audits that their suppliers were being subjected to. Retailers were having extensive costs in running technical businesses where they sent people out to do audits time and time again. And so what we were looking for, then, was a system where we could simplify the whole process. And GFSI was seen to be the way to do that. GFSI had a mantra which was certified once, accepted everywhere. And that's one of the main issues. And so that means that, a company got a GFSI endorsed certificate, all the retailers would accept it. So the responsibility of the GFSI is to maintain the various committees to develop, review and update the benchmark requirements, and to benchmark the documents. And, the benchmark requirements go to the standards, but also to the certification bodies, the auditors and so forth. They're developing different types of documents related to the operation of one of these standards. And this is their basic responsibility. The issue mentioned earlier on was that the standards owner, and what they do rely on is a standards owner to ensure that the requirements that they've developed are enforced. And mentioned before as well, the standards owner then passes that back on down to the certification body. There are agencies involved in this whole process of enforcement. And we'll talk about that. I'll talk into that a little bit later. The Global Food Safety Initiative runs an annual international food safety conference, and they've just had one in Barcelona. I think it was in Spain. I understand it was very successful, and it was a good place for people to communicate and so forth. So that's what GFSI does. Some concerns that I have now. I sort of want to move on to some of the concerns I have. There are reported numerous incidents of inconsistency in audits as far as GFSI is concerned. I mean, I've seen articles written in various publications on topic. Before that, retailers are still applying add-ons to the audit, making audits more costly, more expensive, more detailed. And when you have an add-on to the audit, the supplier then has to go and tinker with their management system to make sure they meet those requirements. Others are insisting on setting a maximum time it will take for audits, and I mentioned that before, and they're dealing through the various requirements, so that, you know, if in fact there was a point then I was with FSQA that really didn't set times for it. You said, look, you know, an audit needs to go out, they need to do the job, and they need to do it properly, and if they take extra time to do that, well, so be it. But, you know, that was, I guess, a negative, and so companies or suppliers were choosing, or retailers were asking suppliers to put in different systems because a different standard may have shorter times and therefore shorter audit costs. Not really a very sensible way of going about it, but, you know, this is the reality of life. There's no advantage to suppliers when retailers will not accept certificates issued by some certifications. I mean, what's the point of putting a Global Food Safety Initiative standard in place? an SQF, ISO 22000, IFS standard, if it's accepted by some, and you then have to go to the expense of putting another system in place, having another audit. What advantage is there to suppliers? It costs them a lot, causes them a lot of pain and suffering, and, you know, really at the end of the day, this is a real issue that seems to be cropping up. The certification body of achieving and maintaining accreditation is very high. So certification bodies, as I mentioned earlier on, need to be audited, they need to be accredited, they're accredited by the diverse accreditation bodies around the world, and those costs are high, and they pass those costs on. So these are some of the issues that I've come across. I go back to that point as well. One other thing I wanted to mention is trust in the GFSI benchmark standard eroded when a number of negative issues occur. Negative issues such as, you know, the problems into countries where the certification body isn't doing their audits properly. You know, I personally experienced here in Australia a situation with a company that I was working with. I'm working with them, by the way. Where, you know, I just couldn't understand how they had a education. Everything was quite out of whack in terms of, you know, their food safety, their hygiene and sanitation. The risk processing plant functions was very poor. Cross-contamination was a real issue, and I just couldn't understand how they'd achieve certification. And I happened to be there when an auditor was coming along to audit the plant. And my bewilderment, I just saw a complete snow job done on an auditor who I thought was quite experienced. That company is still certified, and I still can't understand why. So, you know, there's, I guess, sort of looked anyway. I think what we need to look at, and it's not covered in this presentation, but what I think needs to be addressed is the commitment of companies to put systems in place to deliver the outcomes that everyone wants. And I think the audit needs to look a lot more closely at the level of commitment of a company, and I think that that's very important. Some food safety incidents remain an issue. Also, the food supply chain know their responsibility. We've been down that track. I've illustrated that through the presentation. Everyone knows what they have to do. It's just that because of various outside forces or inability of people to comply, we have breakdowns, and when we have breakdowns, we have food safety incidents. The Global Food Safety Initiative of certified once, accepted everywhere, I don't believe is achievable. It's not achievable in today's environment, and I think that you know, we have to accept that fact. and it's not going to be achievable as long as retailers will insist on Global Food Safety Initiative members insist on suppliers implementing different schemes. So to finish off with is where to from here, some questions. Is the role of the Global Food Safety Initiative sustainable? Can they continue going on doing what they're doing? Developing benchmark requirements, making documents, more coming into the system. But really, what's changing? And this is my question, is it sustainable? What does the accreditation body really bring to the Global Food Safety Initiative? And the accreditation body, I know that I've sort of glossed over this, but the accreditation body is the one that accredits the certification bodies, as I've mentioned. And what value do they bring? They implement great cost to make sure that the certification bodies are doing what they're supposed to be doing. What is the outcome? What's really happening? And how value do they bring to GFSI? And I have is, can GFSI be more proactive in the oversight of auditing and certification? So this sort of builds on from my second point, point two. It's a question that I think, and I've pondered for some time, and through my recent experiences, I think that it's something that possibly GFSI could be at having a change of direction. So my thoughts are, should GFSI become the food industry's accreditation body? I think food for thought. There are a number of plus for this. I think there's a need for it. I think that in the process of becoming one accreditation body, accrediting all certification bodies, accrediting and certifying auditors as meeting certain standards, all of that information and that responsibility lies with central entity. We might be able to get a little bit more sense in the whole process. So that's food for thought, and possibly food or for another presentation. So I want to leave you with that and pass you back to Rick. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Paul. You brought on great points, and you've got some really thought-provoking ideas that we'll come back to in a minute with some questions. But our next speaker I'd like to introduce, who is Barry Maxon. He's a Senior Vice President and co-founder of SafetyChain Software, who is sponsor for today's event. Founder of SafetyChain Software, Barry is focused on helping customers identify strategic solutions to close gaps in their food safety and quality enterprises. With a strong management and consulting background, Barry has an in-depth understanding of how to build a business case and gain buy-in for technology projects that are tied to business initiatives. Barry has previously served as a management consultant at A.T. Kearney and was an officer in the U.S. Navy. I'd like to turn things over to Barry now. Barry?
Thanks, Rick. Appreciate that. Paul, a lot of great insights there, and I appreciate the thoroughness of everything that you went through. I'll be brief in this portion of the presentation, but I don't want that brevity to lose the importance of what's gone in the industry. As I listened to Paul go through all of his slides, really what struck me is, God, there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure coming from all sorts of angles in terms of consumer, regulatory, the supply chain, retailers, and really what that is struck me as feeling like is a lot of this is rolling downhill and just to our plates. And fundamentally, what it's doing is teaching us as food safety professionals to fundamentally do more with less. And as this happens, what we're beginning to see in the industry is a shift toward beginning to really look at how technology can play a role in helping us do more with less, how it can play a role in helping us keep up with the changing world of regulatory, with FSQA, how it can help us be more attuned to the demands of the supply chain and meeting consumer expectations. And what is happening is technology is allowing us to become a lot more proactive proactive in how we manage our processes versus reactive. And what it's about is making data actionable in real time. Organizations spend a tremendous amount of time and money in collecting data, and yet most often it sits in file cabinets or in spreadsheets and is barely used. It's barely scratched, and it's barely ever mined in any fashion that can help us take real-time action. And so technology is beginning to play a much more substantial role in helping suppliers, producers, distributors, and even customers gain operational efficiencies. It helps us reduce risk. It helps us promote regulatory and third-party and customer compliance standards. But it's there to help protect our market value and our brand. And so what we're beginning to look at is how technology plays a role in food safety and food quality, but it actually extends beyond the four walls of your organization. It extends, even if you look at the FSMA law, one up and down within your supply chain. And so there's a lot going on with technology. But what does this actually mean? What does it actually look like? Well, fundamental technology is about automating, and it's about automating what you do today. And a lot of companies think about technology as being something additive to what you do today, added cost. But in reality, it's a lot like other technology that you think of. Think of email. It used to be that we would look stamps, write letters, and do it the old snail mail, old-fashioned way. Today we send an email. Technology is fundamentally about taking what you do today from a process perspective and automate it in a way that makes you a lot more efficient. But again, to automate, what you're doing is that you're eliminating a lot of the noise. If you think about it today, your process could be that you receive a certificate of analysis, or you review from a laboratory lab result. You have someone that's going through all the final steps of a pre-shipment review. All of these are fundamentally processes that require the collection and the analysis and the review of data. Technology can automate all of that in such a way that it eliminates the noise of you don't have to have someone look at every single piece of paper today. Instead, you have a database that centralizes and analyzes that data for you and bubbles up only the items that are out of compliance and allows you to take more immediate corrective action. And by collecting all this data and being able to take faster corrective actions, you can begin to prevent problems from happening. And it actually gives you real-time data in such a way that you can analyze and report and trend on it in a much more timely fashion. So instead of having to collect data from all your suppliers on a month, quarterly, or annual basis and then look at it and figure out, well, what happened in the past, you can begin to take action a lot sooner. So technology is fundamentally changing how we manage our processes, how we manage our data. What this allows you to do then is also achieve a lot of the compliance requirements that are beginning to come. Not only are consumers increasing the demands on the organization, government is responding to that and adding a layer of compliance requirements that are only going to grow over time. But what's most important is regulatory burden is added cost. Technology allows you to realize an actual hard dollar return on investment. So this isn't about using and adopting technology to just comply with audit standards. It isn't about adopting technology to comply with government regulatory. It actually delivers an operational efficiency to your bottom line. It does it through efficiencies with time and labor. It through improving your yield. It does by improving analysis and reducing the time that you have to spend on reporting and analysis. It does it by mitigating risk. And what you know here is on the right-hand side, this chart shows that the longer a problem exists, the further down the supply chain it gets. These events can go from something that's very minor to something that can grow and spin out of control. And the cost of resolution only goes up as the discovery time extends longer. So the role of technology is to help you identify problem areas a lot sooner so that you can reduce your overall cost of dealing with these particular events. Safety chain difference in terms of applying technology here, once again, we talked about being proactive versus reactive. It's about having a smoke alarm versus doing forensic analysis after the fire occurred. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And so by using technology to fill out all of the noise and get you to where there's a particular problem, you can take corrective actions a lot sooner. You can actually scorecard your particular suppliers and see which supplier is a high-risk supplier for a high-risk product. I need to go address and take corrective actions a lot sooner so I don't have a problem happening. In your production process, it's a process beginning to get out of control. You can identify that data a lot sooner and take immediate real-time corrective actions versus waiting after the fact to take care of a problem. And this is where technology makes a profound difference and ability to do more with less, and not only do more with less, actually prevent problems from happening and take a much more proactive stance in how we manage our entire supply chain and food distribution versus a reactive one. So as you look at the Safety Chain technology suite, it's designed to be a very comprehensive solution that addresses your entire supply chain, both on the inbound side with supply compliance, automation of COA and specifications management, to all of your internal activities, be it GFSI compliance with the various standards, HACCP program automation, all of your safety and quality data management, including LIMS automation, statistical process control, everything that you need to manage the entirety of your food safety and quality programs can be automated through a technology. It frees up that's being spent on paperwork and allows you to really get a lot more focused on the strategic management of all of your food safety and quality programs. A lot of technology today is not only about databases, but it's actually about how do you collect data in a much more efficient way. And so here you can see a lot of data can be collected through automation, integration specifically to devices in your testing programs, devices that are in your manufacturing process, as well as we're beginning to see the wide-scale adoption of handheld devices, look from the field, out in the farm, all the way down to quick service restaurants at the table, where tablets, handheld devices are being used to deliver efficiencies to the people that are actually doing the work of delivering your programs. So that's just a brief overview about how technology is being used to help us do more with less. It's being used to help us really not only keep abreast and have better ability to comply with the various standards, but actually help us do our jobs in a much more efficient basis and fundamentally help prevent things from happening and take a much more proactive stance in how we manage our food safety and quality programs. And I appreciate your time. I noticed that there were some Safety Chain customers on the call today, and we appreciate you attending and being a participant in this.
Thank you. You made some really good points, and we'll begin the Q&A session right now. But one of the things that you had mentioned that I keep hearing over and over is being proactive versus reactive. And a lot of times what that translates to is a food company's food safety culture and the culture that they have, what the management feels about food safety culture. And, I'm going to address this question really to both of you, starting with Paul. But, Paul, you brought up topics of like fraudulent GFSI certifications or certificates. And so what advice would you give our audience on how to identify these things as they're out in the field? How do you protect your company from sort of the fraudulent type of certifications?
Question, Rick. Well, it's pretty. It depends on the systems that the standards owners have in place, and I guess I can just go back to the program that I put in place with SQF, and that was that any company, any licensed certification body that issued a certificate, they need to come through the SQF substitute to the number that went on that certificate. And so in that way, we knew which supplier was certified. And we also knew which certification bodies were licensed to provide that service. So in the instance that I mentioned, the company that issued the certificate wasn't licensed with us for a start. And, so, you know, the certificate didn't have a number. And so a fairly simple process for a customer to contact the owner and verify that the certificate is valid. In some cases, with SQF in particular, you know, you can now look up on the internet, you can source the name of the supplier, and if the supplier is mentioned there, they will pop up, and you soon see that they are certified, the term of the certification, when the certificate is about to expire. So it's fairly, you know, the standard owners, I think, have all got this process in place now, and it's just a simple phone call to the certification body or to the standards owner just to clarify whether the certificate is valid.
Okay, that's helpful. Something I didn't mention in today's presentation, but that is certainly front and center in the food safety and quality market, especially here in the States, is the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. And there are some parallels to FSMA in terms of managing, you know, one being trying to be proactive versus reactive, and two, the fact that it's based on certain types of audits and guidelines that in some cases might be, I would call it parallel to GFSI, but you know, there are, you know, these two main acronyms out in the industry right now that are still having companies, retailers, and growers looking at how to be in compliant with their customers' requirements for GFSI and perhaps the government's requirements for Food Safety Modernization Act. And again, I put this out to both of you, and maybe I'd start with Barry. The Modernization Act has two of the proposed rules, preventative rules and now produce safety. And in both cases, for smaller companies, there's certain exemptions, and but they're necessarily exemptions for GFSI. So a customer might still require a GFSI. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that a small supplier might have when one of their customers says, listen, we just signed up for SafetyChain and you now need to going to be compliant with this? You know, how impactful is that going to be on, let's say, a small company providing the data needed that's being required for one of your customers?
It's a major impact, and I think unfortunately a lot of small companies initially don't realize just how much goes into going through that certification process. You know, the programs, the documentations, the processes, the forms, the reports, the data validations that you have to have, and the record keeping that you have to have. It's pretty significant effort. And so what, you know, kind of gets back to fundamentally, even on the prior question, it kind of struck me when Paul was saying, hey, you know, it's actually a really simple process to make a phone call, right? And it's one thing for a small company to say, hey, we're going to build out our SOPs and we're going to get our documentation in place and we're going to show how we have preventative controls. But at the end of the day, what winds up happening across the board, be it you're a small company or even a large company, you start, unfortunately, it's about doing more with less. People start to just get overwhelmed and overrun with paper and data and reports and having to keep on top of it all. And so that's why we see a lot of organizations are beginning to use the technology to help keep up with all of that, so they don't get overwhelmed with all of the shuffling of data and reports that they have to keep the appropriate records. And so look at both sides of that coin, right? The FSMA side and GFSI side. On the FSMA side, the government is saying, we want you to use technology because that will ensure, that adds an additional level of rigor to ensuring you have preventative controls, not only documented, but actually being implemented in real time. And on the GFSI side, what we see happening is literally with technology can pre-deliver all of the standards and codifications and the framework that organizations need to be SQF compliant or to be BRC compliant. And so that's what we see happening, is that a lot of the small companies initially don't realize what an effort that is, but if they're going to be in business, they have to start moving in this direction. So a lot of our customers, especially smaller ones, are beginning to leverage technology so that they can actually get these standards in place.
Thank you. With FSMA, a lot of it is HACCP based, and many companies are familiar or have a HACCP program. Barry, can you expand on the conversation going back to small companies, but maybe it also goes into mid-sized, larger companies. But basically, I think it's a statement to say that many companies have a HACCP program. So how does SafetyChain support HACCP and compliance automation?
When you look at what's going on within HACCP, I mean, you can literally get to the level of, if you have to do a count of temperature, a data element for temperature, or a metal detector check, today someone's write that down pen on paper. The technology is there today that you can literally have an automated temperature probe that's monitoring a control point. You have a automated form that ensures that your sanitation program is being done. And how often, Paul, I'm sure you've seen this, where you go in to do an audit and you look at the records and you wonder, was that check really done every 3 hours? Was it really on time? Hey, all the pen and ink on this page appears to be in the same color and the same handwriting, or you see on the reverse things being done that make the records look like that. Technology is being used today to ensure that people are actually doing the right checks at the time, and that the right corrective actions are being prompted, because you've got to ensure that these programs, especially if you are running multiple shifts, if you're running on a 2 or 3 hour shift a day type of basis, the safety person may not always be there to make sure that it's being done correctly and at the right point in time. So technology is being used to automate how the data is collected. It's being used to automate to ensure that people are doing the right things and to get them directed to do the right things. And it holds it all together so that when someone walks in and say, show me the record that ensures that you followed that process, and it sits in the database, so with the push of a button, you're audit ready, and no longer do you have to spend weeks getting ready for an audit. By implementing technology, you're always in real time ready to support a surprise audit.
Great, thank you. And really, what I can think is the last question. I'm going to steer it back to you, Paul. Basically, what Barry's saying is that we can use technology as a method of assuring that things are done right. But ultimately, it's at the top of any company, and we go back to this food safety culture, if you will. What would you give our audience on when they're either looking at a new supplier or even going back and auditing a current supplier? How do you audit a company's food safety culture?
Yeah, hard one, Rick. I think the advice I give to anyone looking for a new supplier, and I think a good start is to ensure that the companies have a GFSI standard in place. I think that's the first point. The second point is to a good customer-supplier relationship. At the end of the day, it's all about trust. And determine whether a company is committed to what's written down in their in their quality system. How he knows they're committed to making the hard decisions when they need to either pull product out of the system because it's not right, or to make changes in a process because they need to make that process a bit safer. That's a difficult one, and that's where I think when you work with a supplier and you can establish they are prepared to do, well, then you can see long-term relationships begin. I think just having an audit to do the way we currently do it isn't necessarily doing it. I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, or towards the end of my presentation, that we need to look at how we can establish whether a company is committed, how we can look more food safety culture. It's pretty easy these days to pass it and put it in place, have it running. That's not a deal. It's once you've done that, seeing how a company complies with what they've written every day, all the time, how they make sure that the validations are correct, that they're verifying and so forth when they're supposed to. And getting back to Barry's point about the documentation, making sure they're going to do a recording of a particular limit or whatever, that recording is realistic. I don't think you're going to record something every 15 minutes, but when the task of doing that check and then recording that particular inspection point or whatever takes about 2 or 3 minutes to do that. Because at the end of the day, when you add that up over a day, you're looking at losing 8 to 12 minutes out of an hour. Over the course of an 8-hour day, you're looking at 80 minutes lost because of that one employee, because of keeping all of those possibly unnecessary recordings. So it gets back to your risk management, doing your risk management properly, and making sure that it's realistic. I've seen examples of the work that I'm currently doing at the moment where it's clear that the companies are doing the checks that they're supposed to be doing, not because it's physically impossible for them to do it. They set times for doing tests that are just impossible. And unless the auditor can go in there and dig deep and find these issues out, well then, we're going to have problems. So I hope that's answered your question. I think that, if you get the system designed correctly, if you get done, and as Barry's mentioned, I'm a big fan of moving towards more technology to help with this process. You're going to see that companies are more committed, that they're going to be more prepared to make hard decisions, and I think retail and buyers can have better long-term relationships with them.
Great. Well, thank you. I wanted to thank you both. I think the message we could leave to everyone based on both these presentations and the questions is, when you're dealing with your suppliers, trust but verify. So on that note, I'll turn things over to Patty to conclude the webinar.
Thanks so much, everybody, and thank you for everybody for hanging out with us a little bit longer today. For more information on SafetyChain Software, please feel free to reach out to them at info@safetychain.com, and their phone number is 888-235-7540. SafetyChain for Food helps save time, save money, and create efficiencies that support FSQA compliance at all points along your supply chain. I want to direct your attention to our resource center on food supply chain. And if you go to the FoodSafetyTech.com website and click on Resource Center, you will find information on breaking news, strategic white papers, polls, and other webinars and archives. Rick, one quick plug, if you want to talk just a little bit about the event that we're having in Chicago on May 15th through 17th.
We'll be covering this topic and many more in quite detail in our conference in 2 months. And and we'll be having a panel discussion called Food Safety is Good for Business, which talks about the aspects of a food safety culture within a company and why it's good for business. The also dives deep into the FSQA regulations and where we're at now, what companies can do to prepare for it, and what parts of the proposed rules will probably not change, and so that they can prepare for the final rules, which should be out by the end of this year. And it's a great program. SafetyChain's been a supporter of it. Paul was a speaker last year, and it's growing in momentum. So I invite everyone to check it out and see if it fits in your schedule.
Thanks. And we're getting a lot of nice feedback on the presentations today. And we will be sending you out a copy of SafetyChain will be emailing you a link to the slides as well as a link to the archived recording, so you can have this as a resource as well as share it with your colleagues. And you should be getting that by close of business on Monday, March 18th. So thank you again, everybody. Have a great day. This concludes our webinar.